posting this so that if you need a review or if you're not here, you can watch these things. All right. It just means, unfortunately, you'll have to hear my voice, but oh well. That's the way it goes. All right, so go File, Open Recent, and find your template file. And we're picking up where we left off yesterday, which I believe was we were going over the different types of selection tools and how they are different. They all do the same thing, but in different ways. So you've got the marquee tool, which just selects large areas. You've got the lasso tool, which allows you to do freehand, like draw freehand selections. And then you have the quick selection and magic wand that are bundled together here. And again, the magic wand is good for clicking on single colors. All right, so if you have, remember like we did with Batman here yesterday, if you have an image that's got a single color background, it's easy to select that color and get rid of it so that you have a clean selection. The quick select tool is better for when you are trying to isolate something from a colored background that has lots of colors in it, and you're trying to gradually grow a selection. That's how we did Robin here. And then remember we did select, and I believe it was either modify or it was one of those things where we went in and smoothed up the edges. So continuing on. And like I said, what I'm doing first is I'm just kind of going down the list of tools and kind of just briefly explaining what they all do. Then we'll start getting more into the functionality of the box. Okay. All right. Fifth one down on the toolbar right here. This is the crop tool bundled with perspective and slice. You don't really need these other ones. And the crop tool you don't need much of, but I'll explain it briefly. Basically, with the crop tool, you are dragging and selecting an area. And if you were to hit enter, that has now cropped my image to this, which is not something I want to do, so I'm going to undo it, Control Z. But that's what that does. Okay. Next one down is the eyedropper tool. This one is handy because it allows you to sample colors. All right, I talked yesterday about how you see these two squares down here at the bottom. See where my laser is? Right down here where my cursor is. These are your foreground and background colors. These are the colors that you use for painting, for adding fills, doing stroke outlines, things like that. Okay. This little curved arrow here, if you click on it, it switches you back and forth between foreground and background color. If you want to change these colors, you can either go up here if you have your swatches open and just click on a swatch, and you see how that color is changing down there. The foreground color is changing. All right, you can do it that way, or you can double click on that square, and it brings up your color picker, and you can select a color that way. Or you can use this eyedropper tool. The eyedropper will sample any color from an image. So watch what happens to my foreground color when I click and hold the eyedropper tool. It'll also display here on the cursor. You see how the cursor is, I'm basically left clicking and holding my mouse right now. See how the top of that arc, that little curved line on top, that's displaying the foreground color. All right, and it's changing depending on where I have my cursor. The bottom of the arc is the background color. All right. So if you are trying to color match something, if you're trying to unify things with a specific color, or you're trying to get a certain color like that you have in a photograph and you can't find the swatch for it, just use the eyedropper tool and it's super easy. Let me also say briefly that if you switch from swatches to color on this tab here, that's also another color picker. The other thing you can do, if you want, is you can get the information for your color. All right. So if you double click on where it says color on this little box here, you're going to see these letters, RGB, CMYK. All right. Each color swatch has its own values associated with it. So if you are working in print or let's say web design or something, when you're dealing with publications, sometimes you'll have to supply the CMYK values of a color or the RGB values of a color to identify it, like with Pantone colors or something. So this is where you would find the information, and watch how these numbers change depending on what color I select. All right. You don't really need to know that for this, but it's just handy to know. Okay, so just keep that in mind. So on the color picker, just double click on this and that'll bring up your color info. All right, so next one down is the healing brush. This basically is meant to restore parts of an image within the same work session that maybe you have erased. But we don't really need it for this, so I'm not going to go into it, but that's just what it does, in case you were curious. Okay, the brush tool, this one right here. This one's also bundled with the pencil, color replacement, and the mixer brush. Basically, the brush and pencil tools are for painting. Okay, so if you're just drawing something, let me create a new layer here. I can select this brush tool, and right now I've got this pink color, but right, so I'm just drawing with my brush. You probably won't need it much for this, but that's just what it does. The pencil tool does the same thing, except it is not anti-aliased, okay? Notice how when I did the brush, the edges were very soft and fuzzy, and this is very crisp. That's called anti-aliasing. Yes. Yeah, by making a selection. Mm-hmm. Yes. Okay. So right now I don't have any selections active. That's why I can pretty much color over everything. All right. Now, I'm going to explain this more than once, but notice how right now I'm coloring, and you see how Batman's not getting covered up, but everything else is? Any theories as to why that's happening? Layers, very good. What's happening is the layer that I currently have selected and that I am on is underneath the layer with Batman on it. And where is that? Here's a tip. If you have a lot of layers open, a lot of different layers, and you don't know where something is, like what layer something is on, select the move tool and right click it and look what happens. You get a little list here. This is all of the layers that are located where I just clicked. The top one is going to be the one that Batman is on. That's layer 7. And you can go through and select the layer that you need. And there it is at the very top. Anytime you want to turn a layer off or on, you use a little eyeball here. And that's the layer's still there. It's not going anywhere. It's still part of the image, but it's like turning on a light switch on and off. Okay. Okay. So that's basically, I mean, that was just the pencil and brush tool. The only other thing I'll say about it is that if at any time you want to change the brush style, go up here. Remember where these options are up top? I showed you this yesterday. And remember how all the options change depending on what tool you have? Go up here and you have some preset brush sizes that you can go to. You can also scroll up here to change the size of your brush. You can also create brushes, which is kind of a neat thing. I will show you that real quick. Anything that is very high contrast will make a good brush. But I'll just go ahead and make a brush of Batman right here. All right, so I'm going to get my selection tool. I'm going to select Batman. Now I'm going to go up to Edit. And I'm going to go down to Define Brush Preset. Click on that. It'll say Sampled Brush 1. You can name it whatever you want. I'll name it Batman, appropriately enough. Now, I go back up to, I select my brushes or my pencil, either one, it'll work. Click on that. You see all these little brushes I have here? Look who's on the very last brush. It's our pal Batman. I'm going to select the Batman brush. Now you see how my cursor is shaped like Batman? So now depending on what color I have, boom. Let me create a new layer. Woo! I'll select a lighter color. Woo! So kind of cool. I don't know. Sometimes if you're doing something like you have to repeat something like leaves. If you're doing like a tree and you're doing a leaf pattern or a grass pattern or something like that, making a brush is handy. You might not need it for anything else. Or like another example is if you're doing like an underwater kind of a scene and you're doing bubbles or something, you can make a brush that looks like a bubble, and so there are people online that make all kinds of different brushes, and you can buy them and install them in Photoshop. And a lot of comic illustrators have brushes that simulate, like when they do digital inking, they simulate a brush. So kind of cool. All right, but I don't want any of this stuff, so I'm just going to delete that layer. I'll just turn it off. All right, again, the benefit of using layers, right? Okay, next one down is the clone stamp. This is pretty cool, actually. So the clone stamp will sample the area of any image and then replicate it wherever you tell it to. So this is good for doing like spot the difference kind of activities, or if you're just trying to touch up part of an image. And I'll show you how it works. First, let me open a different image. Let's open up this one. And just give it a minute. It's working very slow today. Okay. let's say I want to, I don't know. I'll just show you how it works. This isn't the greatest image to work from, but you'll get the idea. Okay. So the first thing you do when you're using the clone stamp is you have to choose the area that you're going to sample from. All right, you see I've got my cursor here. And you hold down Alt, and watch what happens to the cursor when you hold down Alt. It turns to a little target, right? So choose, just any area that you're going to, sample from. I'll just click green arrow's head right here. Click it once and then let it go. Now you see how that area is being displayed inside the cursor. So that's telling you, okay, once you start painting, this is your starting point from this area. And as long as I left click and hold down the tool, it's going to continue painting from this point on. So now I choose the area that I want to start painting in, and I'm just going to click and hold. And you see now it's starting to repeat everything in there. I'd probably get better results if I made my brush a little smaller. Again, bracket keys, left bracket makes the brush smaller, right bracket makes it larger. So, you can do kind of funky things, like let's zoom in a little bit here. Like if I wanted to do something really zany, like give Batman a third eye, or get rid of his bat symbol, I can select the gray around it. Oops, I went too far there. See how I'm doing that? So like, let's say I'm doing an activity on my box where I'm like, spot the differences, and I put an image like this up, and then I duplicate it and put them side by side, and then I'm just trying to make some minor alterations so that, like, little kids can look at it and say, what's the difference here? And like, oh, look, Batman's missing his chest symbol, or he's got a third eye on his forehead, or, Green Arrow's arrow only has one little thing instead of two, or, this is the clone stamp is a good way to do that. Right? Does that make sense? So when you have the tool selected, first thing you do, choose the area you want to clone from, hold down Alt, look for the little target, little crosshairs, left click once, then let go, and then once you see the image displayed inside the cursor, you can start painting. And again, I can enlarge. The bigger I make the brush, the larger the area is that the sample is from. And then you just click and hold the left button down to start painting. Right? So that's the clone stamp in a nutshell. All right. The history brush, you don't need to worry about that. I'm not even going to get into it. Eraser tool does what it says. It erases stuff. Now, if you have, let's go back to our template, an image like this, where you just have one layer of something, and there's nothing underneath it, it'll just erase it clean. See that? So that's all the eraser tool does. However, if you're like, let's say you're on like a background layer and you're erasing it, it's usually going to fill the hole with whatever the background color is set at. So right now, if I went on the bottommost layer and started erasing, it would just fill with white because that's my background color. All right. The other cool thing about the erase tool, which is handy, is you can adjust the opacity. And you can also do this with the brush and pencil tool. So if you go up here again where my cursor is, where my laser's at up here, you see opacity. If I take the opacity of my eraser down to, let's say, I don't know, 20%, 21%, and I start erasing, let's zoom in a little closer here. See, I'm starting to get a faded kind of look. So you can take the opacity down and just sort of gently erase certain areas. So if you want like a nice faded effect to one of your images or one of your layers, but you don't want to do it over the whole thing, you can do something like that, like, ooh, Batman's turning invisible, right? Now, you can also do that same effect with over here on layers. There's also a layer opacity button, but that's going to do the entire layer. It won't do just part of it like this. So, you know, handy. Okay, so that's the eraser tool. Next, gradients. The gradient tool. All right, yesterday I showed you how to fill with a single color. So now we're going to make another selection. I'm going to go back down to my template layer here. I'm going to get my magic wand and I'm going to select this side of my box. All right. I'm going to change my foreground color to red and my background color is going to be yellow, just for the heck of it. Now, the gradient tool will fill an area with my foreground and background colors or other colors that I choose. Again, if you go up here to your little options bar, right now it is set to fill from yellow to transparent. And because my background is pretty much white, the template is white, it's just going to look like yellow to white. But if I click on this little arrow button, I've got all these different types of gradients that it'll do. So I'm going to choose the first one, foreground to background. Now, because I have my selection active, it's only going to fill inside the selection, which is what I want. So you click and drag, and whichever direction that you drag your cursor, that is going to be the direction that it fills. So if you drag diagonally, you know, up to down, it's going to fill diagonally from foreground to background. If you drag down to up, it's going to do the reverse. All right? The longer the distance that I drag my cursor, the more subtle the blended area of the gradient will be. See right there on this, I just barely dragged it. So it's a very harsh transition from yellow to red. But if I really make it long, it's a much smoother blend. Yes. Well, in this case, all it's doing is it's just it's just filling over the last one I did. It's not getting rid of it. It's just going over it. Oh, well, just Control Z, undo. Yeah. If you don't learn any other hotkeys, at least you should know Control Z is undo or redo, and Alt Control Z is for multiple undos. If you just have to go back one step, Control Z will do it. If you got to go back more than one step, you got to do Alt Control Z. All right. That will save you tons of time, so that way you don't have to keep going edit undo every time. That's insanity. All right. So that's the gradient tool. I can do left to right, right to left. If I go outside the boundaries of the selection, thank you for that email. Okay. All right, so that's the gradient tool in a nutshell. The other cool thing is that you can do multiple selections. So let's say in addition to this one, I want to do this one too. I get my magic wand once again, hold down Shift, select this. I'll select this one as well, and this one. Now, when I go back to my gradient and drag, it goes over all four of them. Right? Now, I made a mistake, kind of intentionally, because I wanted to make a point. One thing that I did not do here, see on my background copy, I put all of my fills on the same layer as my template image. Okay? That is a huge no-no, because now that's contaminated with color. So let's say I deselect this. I'm going to hit Control D to deselect. Now let's say I want to go back to this and change the color, like I'm not happy with it. Well, when I go to select the template image with the magic wand, look what happens. Right? It's not selecting everything. I've messed it up. What I should have done is created a new layer first and then added the fills to that layer. So that way, if I didn't want it anymore, all I have to do is just delete the layer, and I don't have to go back in and redo this. So I did this kind of on purpose to show you why you should always create a new layer when you're doing this, okay? Inevitably, someone will forget, and they will accidentally put a fill on their template layer. This is exactly why I told you guys, remember, do a duplicate of your background. So this is an easy fix. All I have to do now is delete the background copy, right click and say delete layer. It'll ask me, are you sure? I'll say, yes, I'm sure. It goes away. Now I can simply duplicate my clean background layer once more. Boom. If I didn't have that copy, then I would have basically ruined the background layer, and that would have been a lot more trouble to fix. But as it is now, all I have to do is duplicate my background again. I'm all set to go. I can make clean selections again. You just got to remember, when you select, you always got to go back to the template layer to make your selections, then create a new layer and do, whatever fills you want to do. All right, moving on. So that was the gradient tool. The blur and sharpen tools, all right, these pretty much do what they say. Right underneath the, I'm just kind of going down the list here. All right, so right underneath the gradient tool. I'm going to switch over to this. The blur tool makes things blurry. Let me use the bracket key to make my brush smaller. All right, see that? It's a little dark on the projection, but so it's just wherever I'm basically left clicking and holding, and I'm just kind of painting over this. So it's just making things blurry. Undo. Sharpen is the opposite. It makes things crisper and more kind of in focus. This image, however, is so low res that it's going to start making it look really kind of funky. But see how it's like it's overcompensating. It's making it too crisp. It's like making the pixels look weird. It's like he's got sunburn or something. All right, so in a nutshell, that is blur and sharpen. So if you have an image that is slightly a little blurry, if you do a little bit of the sharpen tool, that might help make it a little more in focus, but you don't want to overdo it. Okay, and the blur tool, you know, just in case you want to push something back or for whatever reason, that's that. Okay. The next is dodge and burn and sponge, okay? Dodge makes things brighter, yes. I use Control-Alt+ to zoom in, Control-Alt- to, oh, on a layer, like a separate thing? All right, then you go to Edit. I did this yesterday, but I'll review it. Edit, Transform, Scale. It's grayed out right now because I don't have anything selected, but it would be Edit, Transform, then Scale. And there's also Rotate in there too, where you can rotate things around. Yes. Getting a character on there again. Well, that's where you go back and you, if it's on the background, use the quick selection tool to select it. Then you go under Select, Refine Edge, and smooth it. How do you get it up? Like just open it in photo. Let me pause the movie. So you can move these windows around and you can unanchor them from the top or re-anchor them. It's up to you. Okay. So as I was saying, dodge and burn. Dodge makes things lighter. I think it'll look better on this one. Let me make my cursor larger, again with the bracket tools. Oh, that's the wrong one. So if something's a little on the dark side, you can just click and hold, and it's like you're using the brush tool basically, and you're painting over an area. And you probably can't tell here, but this is actually getting lighter. And you might need to click. See that? Now it's starting to look like something. But I'm not actually painting, even though it looks like I'm painting. I'm actually altering the pixels to be lighter, okay? Which is not always what you're going to want to do, but in this case, it's okay. Okay, burn, which looks like the little fingers, the pinched hand, pinching the fingers, that does the opposite. That is making an area darker. Okay. So if something is too bright or overexposed, you can go in and mess with that. So that's dodge and burn. The sponge tool has more to do with saturation. You know, when we did painting, we talked a little bit about what saturation meant. Saturation of a color is when it's pure out of the tube. It hasn't been diluted with white or gray or anything. It's the pure version of the color, and it's at its most intense. Saturation is kind of another word for intensity when you're talking about color. All right. So if you have an image that has very faded kind of colors, you can use the sponge tool to make it either more saturated or less. So right now it's set at desaturate 13 pixels. I can change the size to make it bigger. Gray is not a great example because gray is already desaturated by default. You can sort of see on the yellow there how it's starting to turn lighter. It's desaturating the color. So anyway, that's that. Okay, go back to our template. The pen tool. The pen tool is used to draw something called a path. Okay, a path is basically a series of points connected by lines that are drawn by mathematical algorithms called vectors. Okay, so you use vectors a lot when you are doing stuff in something called Illustrator. Basically, a vector is like, there's two different ways of doing things in Photoshop. You either have a vector, which is based on something mathematical that the computer does, or you have something that's pixel-based or rasterized. All right. Most of what Photoshop does is pixel-based. So we talked a little bit about resolution and image size yesterday, and I said that you need to make sure that your images are like higher res, like 300 dpi. You don't have to worry about resolution with vectors and paths, because if it's drawn with a path, it's going to be the same resolution, like it's going to be high res no matter how big you enlarge it or how small it is. So a lot of times in graphic design, you'll see people using vector-based images that are done in Adobe Illustrator, because that way they can do a logo or whatever one time, and no matter how big or small it is, it's going to stay the same resolution. So you could have a logo on a tiny business card or a giant billboard, and it's going to be the same because it's being drawn by vectors and not by pixels. So I know you were all dying to know that, but that's what that's about. So the pen tool, you select it and you just left click once to make a little dot there. Then you make another dot, but then I'm not letting go of the mouse button. I'm just dragging. You see how I'm kind of creating that curved line? All right, that is the start of my path. And I can continue clicking and dragging and you come back to where you started to close your path. All right, now that I have this, I can turn it into a selection. I can fill it with a color. I can stroke it with an outline. I can delete and create new anchor points if I need to. See right here, when I right click on any one of these points, it says fill path or stroke path. So let's do fill path. Right now it's set to foreground color. I'll go ahead and switch to background so it's red so it shows up better. Hit OK. Now, see what it did here? It filled, but it only filled this part of it because I forgot I had a selection active here. So I'm going to undo that, hit Control D to deselect. Now I'm going to do it again. Fill path. OK. Now I have filled. So it's sort of like making a selection. But the cool thing about paths is that you can make them follow along, like make text or whatever follow along with them. So that's my cue to go ahead and talk a little bit about the text tool. And I probably won't have time to finish, but I'll at least get it started. If I select the letter T here, the text tool, and I click on this path, and my cursor is now tilted. Let me switch to a smaller font. I'm going to switch to a darker color. Right, so you can use paths and text together, so you can have text following along. So that's kind of a cool little thing. All right, bell's going to ring in a couple minutes, so I will stop here. We will pick up tomorrow.